right, I think we're going to get started. So I cannot resist noting that there's a little bit of Omar Dajani magic going on, because normally for a video talk, the room is not packed and the Zoom is not, they're both not packed to the degree they are tonight. And I think that just tells me what all of us know, how much we appreciate and value my brilliant and joyous colleague. I'm Michael Hunter Schwartz. I'm the Dean of the Law School. Welcome to the 20th of the 21 events of the 100th anniversary of McGeorge and the very final Centennial speaker event in connection with our celebration. It is my great honor to introduce the two Centennial speakers. Aslı Bâli is the Howard M. Holtzman Professor of Law at Yale Law School. Her teaching and research interests include public international law, particularly human rights law, and the law of the International Security Order, and comparative constitutional law with a focus on the Middle East. She has written on the nuclear non-proliferation regime, humanitarian intervention, the roles of race and empire in the interpretation and enforcement of international law, the role of judicial independence in constitutional transitions, federalism and decentralization in the Middle East, and constitutional design in religiously divided societies. Professor Bâli received her doctorate in politics from Princeton University in 2010 and her law degree from Yale. Before joining academia, she worked for the United Nations Office of the High Commission for Human Rights and as associate at Clary Gottlieb, where she specialized in international transactions and sovereign representation. Prior to joining Yale Law School, she taught at UCLA Law School, where she served as the founding faculty director of the Promise Institute for Human Rights and as director of the UCLA Center for Near Eastern Studies. She currently serves as co-chair of the advisory board for the Middle East Division of Human Rights Watch and is chair of both the Task Force on Civil and Human Rights of the Middle East Studies Association and the Mesa Global Academy. She is also on the board of the Ottoman and Turkish Studies Association and on the editorial board of the American Journal of International Law. Omar Dajani. He is the Carol Olson Professor of International Law here at McGeorge, where he teaches contracts, constitutional law, international negotiations, and public international law. His scholarship, which explores how the law operates in the context of international conflict resolution processes and political transitions, focuses on the Middle East, particularly Israel-Palestine. His recent publications include Federalism and Decentralization in the Contemporary Middle East and North Africa at Cambridge University, co-authored with his co-presenter tonight. Before joining the faculty at McGeorge, he served as legal advisor to the Palestinian negotiation team in peace talks with Israel, participating in the summits at Camp David and Taba, and as a political advisor in the Office of the United Nations Special Coordinator for the Middle East Process, UNESCO in Jerusalem. He currently serves as co-chair of the joint board of A Land for All, an Israeli-Palestine peace movement. He's a graduate of Northwestern University and Yale Law School. Now's the part he doesn't want me to say. Omar is also a beloved teacher whom last year's graduating class voted Teacher of the Year, and a beloved colleague whose company we all miss greatly. Having worked closely with him regarding faculty hiring, our global center, and our communications and events surrounding experiences for our students relating to the Palestine-Israel conflict, I can say without equivocation that he has made me a better dean of this law school. And with that, I will get out of their way and let them share their wisdom.
Thanks so much, Mike, for that incredibly generous introduction. As you know, the admiration and affection is really mutual. And if the excellent turnout here suggests that folks miss me a little bit, that does my heart good, since I miss you all terribly. And it really is wonderful to have the chance to be with you virtually in a room, if not in person, for a little bit. Though I very much look forward to seeing you in the fall when I'm back at McGeorge. It's also a really great pleasure to be here with my dear friend and sometimes co-author and colleague Aslı Bâli. Aslı and I have been friends since we were in law school many moons ago. And while we were, or just after I graduated, and while Aslı was still there, we were involved in the creation of a seminar, which is still continuing at Yale Law School, called the Middle East Legal Studies Seminar, which aims to bring together legal scholars from across the Middle East, North Africa region, and as well as folks in the United States and elsewhere who work on the region to talk about evolving topics. It's been a source of some frustration that the topics have evolved more than the politics and governance in the region, or at least evolve more positively. But we keep at it nonetheless. And it was in the context of that seminar that we first began talking about the issues that we hope to explore with you this evening on your end. Aslı and I were involved in a conversation on the Centennial, the 100-year anniversary, another centennial of the Sykes-Picot Agreement, an agreement that presumed to define a set of areas of influence in the Middle East region for Britain, France, and Russia, just before Russia succumbed to revolution. And the Sykes-Picot Agreement, as Aslı has written, to some extent, though maybe a less extent than borders. Now, as we were discussing the Sykes-Picot centenary, one of the things that was very present in our minds at that juncture, as war in Iraq continued to rage, and as a number of other states faced increasing questions around identity conflict and its resolution. How would these heterogeneous places resolve conflicts that, after many years of having been suppressed, were beginning to erupt once again? And a solution that was in the ether at the time, not least because then Vice President or just recently Vice President and now soon to be former President Biden had embraced it, was the idea that the way to deal with heterogeneity, with diversity, ethnic and religious, inside a combustible state was to break the state apart, to draw lines that put Shia on one side and Sunnis on the other, or that put the Kurds over here and the Arabs over there, or that suggested that North and South Yemen might best be separated from each other. And to us, that approach seemed wrong. It seemed at odds with the history and longstanding approach to managing diversity in this region that we both know and love. And it seemed wrong as a means of actually addressing, managing, and hopefully ending conflict. And so we began a process of thinking about what alternatives there were to partition, to simply drawing a boundary and suggesting that the best approach to building peace was to put disputants on each side of it. That produced this book, which I think a number of you have had the great fortune to read whenever you were struggling with insomnia, and has produced a set of other related projects. Now, the book explored institutional design as a framework for dealing with diversity inside states, asking the question of whether decentralizing states in the region might help to address identity conflict as well as other governance issues. And while the states that we surveyed that were suffering from identity conflict, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Israel, Palestine. To some extent, we also looked at a few other states like Lebanon, and Morocco, other states where there were identity conflict, as well as a range of countries where there were governance issues in the region. And while overall what we encountered was much more promise than is the dominant narrative, but still a pretty bleak tableau. But the two cases that we want to tell you about tonight were, for us, points of optimism, reasons to feel hopeful about the possibility of responding to the incredibly difficult question of how you manage difference inside a state. Because what each of these, in very different ways and at different stages in their development and implementation, undertake to do is, instead of drawing new borders, to reimagine what we mean by the relationship between state, nation, and territory. And so it's these two initiatives, democratic confederalism in northern Syria, and to some extent also where it had its origins in Turkey, and binational confederation in Israel-Palestine, an idea that has not yet been implemented, but on which, as the dean mentioned, is something I've been working a lot lately. And so we're going to kind of go back and forth a little bit as we explore these questions. And I'll turn it to Aslı to first talk about the introduction of an idea that got us into this mess in the first place.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Omar. And let me just start by saying I want to echo the words in the introduction of how beloved you are, not only at University of Pacific McGeorge School of Law, but much more broadly in an intellectual community that really benefits from your participation, collaboration, and presence. So thank you for the gift of co-authorship together, and also for giving me this opportunity to be in conversation with you and with your intellectual community at McGeorge. And thank you all so much for having me here today. So where Omar left off is to say that we began this project by querying the idea of partition as a conflict resolution strategy. But this raises the question of, if not partition, then what? In circumstances where there is enormous amount of conflict, often over or channeled through identitarian claims, how might we resolve this? And in the two communities that he mentioned, the context of Palestinians and their relationship to Israel, and the Kurds, which as a community find themselves the largest minority in each of the states where their community is located and divided, Turkey, Iraq, Iran, and Syria, it is not obvious what path forward, if not altering borders. And we had an argument, as Omar alluded to, that partition itself is an extraordinarily dangerous, often deeply violent process. And so seeking alternatives to it is important. But the way that political and legal authority is organized within existing borders may be open to question. So if we're going to leave borders as they are, if we're not going to encourage partitions and the creation of new territories, then one question is, what are alternative configurations of political and legal authority within existing borders that might enable an alternative path forward, one that is less conflictual and one that is better suited to managing the pluralism of territories that are themselves heterogeneous in terms of their demography? And this invites the question of, what is the status of the nation state? So the nation state as an idea is one that surely is familiar to all of you. Oftentimes we simply use the phrase as if it simply means governments or countries as they are located in the international community. So the members of the United Nations are all nation states. That's the idea. But actually the nation state itself is a reasonably modern configuration, even in Europe, and certainly for the rest of the world. So one thing to note about decolonization, which is perhaps an unusual way for us to think about it, is that decolonization was actually ultimately the final victory of the colonial project. What do I mean by that? I mean that the terms on which territories were allowed to decolonize, gain independence from their former colonial metropoles, was by demonstrating that they were capable of being members in good standing of the international community. And what that meant was predefined prior to their independence against a standard that was set by Western Europe, basically, or the Western European imagination. That is to say, having political and legal institutions that look like the states of Europe, having a conception of the identity of the people on a territory that corresponds to the way in which European jurisdictions organize themselves, and having all of the trappings of the state that had already been established in the colonial era as normatively the projects that Europe had achieved on its own continent. So the nation state was generalized as a project of decolonization. In order to become independent, each of the territories that were former administrative units under colonial rule had to reorganize themselves as nation states, whether or not this was the organic way in which they might have organized political and legal authority prior to the colonial encounter, which it was not anywhere in the regions that were colonized by European powers. This was the way in which they were to organize political and legal authority henceforth in order to be entitled to decolonizing. So the generalization of the political and legal institutional forms of state structures of Europe was the condition for other countries, other territories to gain their independence. Now, this nation state is a modern and Western invention that has a very specific history. The idea that political and legal authority on a state correspond to governing in the name of a collective community that has a single national identity defined in terms of ethnic, religious, linguistic, and historical ties suggests that every territory within a particular set of borders is necessarily organized in such a way that the communities within that set of borders identify in a common way around ethnic, religious, and linguistic identity categories. Now, for obvious reasons, if in much of the world that hasn't historically been the case, if many people speaking many languages of many religious backgrounds and of different ethnicities all were intermingled on territories and governed along different lines, for example, dynastic lines that did not presume that the governing class was of the same identity category as the governed, then it might take some doing to organize the populations of these territories into the orderly nations that were meant to correspond to the state institutions that were being formed at decolonization. And this was indeed the case in the Middle East. The Middle East had a long-standing method of social and political organization that had nothing to do with national claims. It had been ruled by dynasties for millennia, the most recent of those, the Ottoman Empire, but the Ottoman Empire itself is a successor to any number of prior empires organized in very similar ways, which is to say, the empire might have a capital and have a ruling dynastic family or tribe or group that governed in hereditary fashion, but it would oversee a very decentralized territory in which the underlying population of the territory did not have to identify with the religion, the language, or the tribal identity of the governors. They might speak other languages or dialects. They might be of a variety of different, either heterodox religious traditions within a majority religion, let's say Islam, or they may be of other religious faiths, Zoroastrians, Christians, Jews, and any number of other smaller sects, Druze, as opposed to Jewish community, Druze community, and many others. And they might speak any number of languages, Arabic, Turkish, Farsi, Kurdish, but also Amazigh and an innumerable number of additional languages in North Africa and in the Arabian Peninsula. Given this longstanding system of social and political organization, where you had a governing, ruling dynastic arrangement that did not impose identity or homogeneity on the territory that was governed, and which governed a very wide expanse on the grounds of decentralization, the idea that political and legal authority had to now be organized in a way that conjoined a single privileged identity group to the political and legal institutions of the state was not just novel, but invited a level of violence that, of course, had indeed attended to the creation of nation states in Europe over centuries of religious wars, of principalities going to war with one another, seeking to impose language, seeking to impose categories of cultural identity neighbors that had resulted in the nation states of Europe over centuries that were very bloody. But this kind of violence would attend the inauguration of the nation state concept in the Middle East in a much more acute fashion if the ruling authorities were not very careful. So there were attempts on each of the territories to engender around toponyms, earlier geographic distinctions, the idea of distinct national identities. Greater Syria became the Syrian people. Egypt, which had long been identified with a series of different empires, became the nation of Egypt. Jordan, an entirely invented category for the purposes of rewarding the Hashemites under British rule, had to invent a Transjordanian identity. Palestine, Lebanon, and so on and so forth. This way of organizing authority is very novel to the region, and one of the important moves that the two communities that we study for the purposes of the study we're going to present to you tonight is to denaturalize that move, to call into question the idea of the equation of nation and state, and to reopen the possibility that political and legal institutions could be organized in such a way that they are not tied to one particular hierarchically superior identity category, but rather that alternative configurations of power and institutional design could disrupt this equation of nation and state that produced assimilationist and repressive practices across the region, and instead raise up again the diversity, the underlying heterogeneity, and use that heterogeneity as a way of channeling political and institutional life in a single set of joint institutions that permitted pluralism of identity. Over to you, Omar.
Thanks very much, Aslı. And so the framework that Aslı just laid out, one in which the nation state emerges as the primary unit for organizing international life in the Middle East as well, will have consequences in a range of different contexts. And one of those contexts, of course, is the context of international law. And you may have noted that our talk asks the question of what form self-determination can take, if not through nationalism and the creation of more and more nation states. And so it's useful to dwell for just a moment before we describe these cases on the idea of self-determination, which those of you studying international law will be familiar with, but which may be less familiar to others in the room. So the International Bill of Rights, which is comprised of a number of treaties, human rights treaties, including the originally General Assembly resolution called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but subsequently two related treaties, the International Covenants on Civil and Political Rights and Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Both make a promise, and the promise is that all peoples will have the right to self-determination, pursuant to which they're entitled to freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. So international law makes that promise to all peoples in pretty sweeping terms. But in practice, as is so often the case with law, and particularly international law, these promises are more contingent and more contained. And so in international law, we see that there are actually two distinct paths to self-determination. On the one hand, we have the International Court of Justice affirming fairly recently in an advisory opinion regarding the independence of Kosovo, that the law of self-determination has developed in such a way as to create a right to independence. Note that word, independence, to have your own state for the peoples of non-self-governing territories. So that's referring to territories that had been under colonial rule, and peoples subject to alien subjugation, domination, and exploitation. So peoples that are subject to foreign control and domination. But this right, which has come to be called a right to external self-determination, is not considered the right of all peoples, only peoples within those categories I mentioned. And there is another category into which a far larger number of groups around the world fall. And so peoples claiming the right to self-determination outside of the circumstances I just named, peoples who already reside within sovereign states, think of Hawaiians, for example, are expected instead to exercise their right to self-determination internally, and to do that through pursuit of that people's political, economic, social, and cultural development within the framework of an existing state, as the Supreme Court of Canada observed. Now, the thing is that whereas international law set up this elaborate framework for overseeing decolonization, it's offered very, very little guidance or oversight with regard to this other area, how groups will achieve self-determination within existing states. And efforts to develop law around those issues have really been fairly limited. They have either tended to treat the members of groups as individuals and give them individual cultural rights. Saying, hey, listen, you have a right as an individual to speak a particular language, but there's not a group right, for example, to teach kids in that language or to have institutions that allow you to nurture your culture. So very often they've just treated folks as individuals, and to the narrow extent that we see these regimes actually treating them as groups, they do, the regimes in question, such as the National Minority Framework Convention in Europe, are non-binding instruments. So they don't have the full force of binding law. And so from the outset, we've got these two different paths, and great majority of peoples around the world fit only into that latter category. And moreover, there is a lot of question about when a particular people is considered part of one group or another, one category or another, and when they're entitled to secession. And so when we look at the cases that we're going to come to now, what we see is two distinct circumstances. On the one hand, in Israel-Palestine, as I'll describe later, you've got a situation where external self-determination would appear clearly to apply, but where the international community has not followed up in assuring its implementation. And on the other hand, with regard to the Kurds, you have a situation where, because of the fact that the Kurds are spread across a number of existing states, the framework imposed upon them is internal self-determination, that is, minority rights. Kurds have faced an uphill battle in seeing their group rights recognized across these spaces. And that battle has been one that they have undertaken to engage in a range of ways. And I'll let Aslı take the story from here.
Great. So just a quick note, the points that Omar has just made and the ones that I made before that. So the generalization of the nation state model across all of the post-colonial world has meant that problems of the kind that we're addressing in this project with respect to the Palestinians and the Kurds actually recur everywhere globally. In other words, the nation state generalized a model of creating permanent majorities and permanent minorities within the boundaries of the states of the global south, where previously there were heterogeneous populations not hierarchically organized in that way. And for the permanent minorities, they are, all of them, trapped essentially in a situation in which they're offered nothing but internal self-determination with no international protections to achieve or mechanisms to enforce the rights that they're meant to be entitled to collectively, to their cultural life, to their ability to pursue their self-determining agency within the existing borders. So they're told you can't change the borders. And once you're in these borders, your fate lies in the hands of whatever the population is that governs. And because the nation state form privileges a particular community over all others within the territory, your fate lies in the hands of a nation, quote unquote, to which you may not identify. That's the common condition of the Kurds and Palestinians, as Omar says, because the mandate of Palestine was subject to a partition by international law. The Palestinians are in the distinctive position of being recognized as entitled to a right of external self-determination from the very origin point of the creation of the state of Israel, but a right that has been forever frustrated. In the case of the Kurds and the many other populations trapped in this circumstance, they don't even have that legal fiction of a right to external self-determination, not that it served the Palestinians particularly well, as we can see. Moreover, the denial of that external right has subjected them to quantums of violence that the Kurds are also familiar with, having been subjected to genocidal violence in Iraq in the 1980s. Okay, so what are these alternative models that these communities are pursuing? And this is an interesting question, particularly because their circumstances are just this adverse. I mean, the situation they find themselves in is really one of not just abject subordination within the borders that they're located in, but also really astonishing quantums of violence being applied precisely to exterminate the kinds of claims they might otherwise make to a territory of their own. Against this backdrop, it's all the more surprising that these two communities have been involved with imagining alternative solutions that might travel through mechanisms to ensure their self-determining rights from within existing borders without making new territorial demands. Of course, they've been constrained to consider what can be achieved from within borders. And the model that they have both alighted upon in different ways through different causal, sort of chains is the model of confederalism. Let me just start by defining confederalism. Confederalism means two or more pre-existing polities joining to form a common government for certain limited purposes, typically to govern the foreign affairs of the territory as a whole, common defense, and sometimes common economy to benefit from economies of scale and oversee economic policy for the territory as a whole. And this common government is composed of delegates who in turn represent the constituent units that have come together for the purposes of joint governance. So this might be somewhat familiar to those who are familiar with American history with the failed project of confederation that preceded the federal government that was created with the Constitution in the United States. And indeed, confederalism has long been consigned to the sort of junk heap of history, if you want, as a failed model and one that doesn't essentially compete well against either the centrifugal forces, that is to say, the ongoing incentives to simply leave the Confederation and regain the pre-existing independent status of the polity, or at least to resolve into an effective form of governance. But these two communities have defied that view from the, let's say, professional political scientists, and taken this idea and imagined it in new and quite innovative ways. So in the Kurdish case, they imagine a confederation that entails a cross-border territorial arrangement that crosses existing national boundary lines. So they would enact a confederation that brings together the Kurdish communities of Turkey, Iraq, Syria, and Iran, ideally, into a set of joint institutions that govern areas of common interest without disrupting the role of existing nation states and without purporting to gain independence from those nation states. As an example, that the theorist that founded this idea of what he calls democratic confederalism, and that theorist is a guerrilla leader named Abdullah Öcalan, who waged a war of independence as the leader of a national liberation movement of the Kurds, known as the Kurdish Workers' Party, from 1984 to about 1999 against the Turkish government in particular. He waged that war from exile in Syria. He was detained with the assistance of the Israelis, actually, and put in solitary confinement in Turkey. He was sentenced to death, and then that sentence was suspended when Turkey submitted its bid to join the European Union. And so since 1999, he has sat in a prison cell in isolation on an island alone for now quite a quarter century, essentially. And he was, before he became an insurgent, a leftist Marxist student in Ankara at university in the capital of Turkey. And he was one of the founders of the Kurdish Workers' Party, which was a Marxist revolutionary organization. And in his solitary confinement, he decided to essentially resume graduate study and picked up where he'd left off, now being confronted with post-Marxism and a range of other readings. And he wrote out a set of theories that he defines as democratic confederalism that imagine, and this is the specific example that he cites, model along the lines of the one currently being developed by the Basque community in Europe. So the Basque community, like the Kurds, is a distinct national community that finds itself divided across existing national lines, namely those of Spain and France. And some elements of the Basque community have also previously fought an insurgency war for independence. But today, the Basque community is understood as a community that is capable of participating in municipal, provincial, state and national and even supranational governance in Europe as French citizens or Spanish citizens in the EU, participating in elections from the municipal to the supranational for EU delegates, and simultaneously maintaining a set of cross-border institutions, distinctively Basque institutions, that oversee cultural life for the Basque community. Citing this idea of nested sovereignties and the possibility of a confederation that crosses existing state boundaries but does not purport to contest existing nation states, Öcalan has elaborated an idea of what it would look like to have a delegative confederation governing particularly cultural and socioeconomic life for the Kurdish communities across their main borders. And he's written elaborate texts and treatises about this. He has used the opportunities he's had to appear in court, in Turkish courts, but also before the European Union courts, to present these theses. And he has a very loyal base of followers in Syria, where he was based during the insurgency period, and in Turkey, amongst the followers of his political party and movement. Because he already had an ideologically cohesive national movement that supported him personally, and also his way of thinking, these treatises were able to be translated into actual political practices on the ground when a very unexpected opportunity arose, which was the opportunity of the Syrian civil war. So the Syrian civil war, which has been brutally violent, as many of you know who followed the Arab uprisings, nonetheless created an opportunity where the Syrian state under Bashar al-Assad essentially withdrew from its northern territory, stopped directly governing in order to husband its resources and marshal its forces to fight an Islamist insurgency, as they would describe it, or the revolutionary actors of the Syrian uprising in the other parts of Syria. What this meant was de facto, the Kurdish community of Syria was left on its own to establish governance arrangements. And with very little hesitation, that community built the institutions of democratic confederalism. This is in a territory wholly that is largely characterized in feudal terms, in terms of large landholding families and longstanding farming arrangements in which much of the community has historically been organized as almost serfs that are basically sharecroppers on feudally owned land. Against that backdrop, this imagined universe of a participatory delegative democracy in which the constituent units are made up of geographic, communal, and categorical representation in a set of highly devolved institutions organized in an economy that is both ecological and feminist, sounds like a literal fever dream of a graduate student somewhere in California, probably. But in fact, far from being a fever dream is the reality of what was built. And so let me just say a word about what each of those phrases that I said means. And here's where the fact that he resumed his graduate studies in solitary confinement becomes relevant, because he read not just Marx, but also Murray Bookchin, an eco-anarchist theorist from Vermont that you may not have heard of, but most Kurds have read in translation, Benedict Anderson, Michel Foucault, and many other theorists. And from Benedict Anderson, he borrowed the idea that the nation state itself is an imagined community, and organizing around principles of nationalism is a mistake and is a way of engaging in new rounds of subordination and producing new permanent minorities within any territory. So instead, he decided that not only would there be geographic representation in this delegative democracy, that is, particular villages or parts of cities, et cetera, would get their own representation in the confederal institutions, but also communal, not just Kurds, also Yazidis and Assyrians and Arabs and Turkish speakers and any other communal group, Armenians, that were present on a territory as heterogeneous as northern Syria would each get their own representative bodies and also categorical. Women would have their own representative bodies. They could be, in other words, selecting delegates to the women's body, to the geographic body of the area they lived in, and to the communal body to which they identified. Categorically, youth would be represented. Categorically, LGBTQ communities would be represented. I want you to imagine a part of Syria under attack by the Islamic State in which you had women's militia groups together with mixed gender militia groups defending a set of democratic institutions that included LGBTQ communal representation, categorical representation. This is not a fantasy. This is something that was actually constructed in 2017, convened a set of elections while fighting the Islamic State, admittedly with aerial cover from NATO, and tried to develop the first experiment in what it would look like to have a democratic confederal arrangement based on the principles of ecological and feminist economic organization and geographic, communal, and categorical representation put together on the territory of northern Syria, and a similar model that I'd be happy to talk about in Q&A if folks are interested in, of these theories turned into a political party platform also exists for municipal and regional electoral purposes in Turkey. So this model of democratic confederalism would allow plural territorial governance because all of the communities located in a territory under this kind of confederal rule would have an opportunity to be represented regardless of their national, communal, or religious identity. Over back to you. Well, maybe I'll say one more thing. This depended on the possibility of the permeability of borders. So while it's a trans-territorial arrangement, it has to be the case that in each of the confederal units across all 4 of the countries, ideally, should the democratic confederal model be generalized to Syria, Turkey, Iraq, and Iran, it would be possible to cross those borders back and forth as members of this confederal arrangement without restriction. So permeable borders, joint trans-identitarian institutions, decentering of the conventional nation state, and a reconfiguration of the relationship between territory, residents, and political authority.
Thanks very much for that, Aslı. I know that it will come as no surprise to anyone in this room who has ever been with me in class that we are running short on time. But I will be very brief in addressing the Israel-Palestine piece, but hope that in question and answer we'll have more opportunity to talk a little bit further. And so what Aslı just described is not only theory, but also practice. This extraordinary experiment that has unfolded on the ground as a consequence of the opportunity created by the horrors of the Syrian civil war and specific territory. The experiment that I want to talk to you about is one that remains in the realm of theory, though it is also supported by a popular movement of Israeli Jews and of Palestinians working together to try to imagine a different kind of future. And what also is being advanced is an idea of confederation, of moving beyond the sense that the only approach for Israel-Palestine is one built around separation, us here, them there, in the words of a campaign slogan that helped to get Ehud Barak elected Prime Minister of Israel back in 1999. Instead, the idea is kind of a hybrid, a little bit non-binary. It imagines, on the one hand, a kind of two-state solution, one in which a Palestinian state is established alongside Israel with a defined border separating the two territories from each other. Whereas the previous vision imagined this border as a wall, what the vision of A Land for All, the movement that I have become very involved with, and of a number of other initiatives or advocating confederation for Israel-Palestine suggest, is that instead of a wall, the border should be a bridge, that we should, by making gradual steps toward freedom of movement, and then ultimately freedom of residence with of course, careful attention to the security of both peoples as such measures are gradually implemented. But by transforming our idea of the border and implementing a framework that resembles the Schengen area in Europe, where some of you who traveled to Europe this last summer for the Salzburg program will know it's possible to move freely across the borders of states, and where it's also possible for, say, a French person to live in Greece as a permanent resident, voting in national elections back in France, but voting in local elections in Greece. That precise framework is the one that's being advocated for Israel-Palestine. And it's being advocated as a framework not only for honoring the attachment of both peoples to all of the land of Israel-Palestine, recognition that this entire space is one that both Jews and Palestinians regard as their homeland, but also taking a step further and by undertaking to reimagine the border, providing solutions to issues that have been incredibly difficult to resolve in the past. And so Palestinian refugees would return to become citizens of the state of Palestine, but could become permanent residents of the state of Israel. Israeli settlers could continue to live in the West Bank as permanent residents of the new state of Palestine. The city of Jerusalem could be a shared capital for both. And issues that are incredibly difficult to deal with when we're talking about a regime of separation, like, for example, adaptation to the incredible climate crisis that is hitting the Middle East harder than almost any region in the world. It becomes possible to erect joint institutions for dealing with those kinds of questions. So there's much, much more that can be laid out. And I'm presently working on a project which Aslı will serve on the advisory board of with a professor at University College London to elaborate very significantly on many dimensions of this. But I want to just make one last point in closing. And then even though we have some concluding remarks, we'll save those maybe for the discussion during question and answer. But the point I want to make in closing is this, that the framework for Israel-Palestine that I've just described is different from the one that Aslı described in Kurdistan, not only in that it remains theoretical, but also in another sense, which is that it is a little friendlier to the nation state than democratic confederalism. It suggests that there may yet be a place for it, but it suggests also that what's best is to create a framework within which there can be evolution of the political model, where we don't become tied resolutely to the idea of ethnic segregation as the framework, and where a two-state solution becomes one not where we have hermetically sealed ethnic states, but instead where we've got two liberal states, each with a majority of a different ethnicity, residing with commitments to ensure constitutionally that pluralism will be safeguarded in both of them. So we very much look forward to your questions or your comments, and with apologies for as long as we've taken, mainly my fault, we will look forward to your questions.
Is someone going to moderate on the questions, or should we be? And we, of course, we can't see the folks in the room who may have questions. Is there a structure
Hi
for
there,
this?
this is Judy. I'll be help moderating.
Thank you.
Hello, thank you guys for the talk. It was really, really interesting. I have a quick question about, portraying this, like the idea of a democratic confederate model to a nation state. Is there any worry that the idea of losing some sovereignty is not very inviting for a nation state to partake in that, democratic model in the sense that, like, even in the Syrian civil war, I'm assuming, the regime is not happy about the Kurdish state trying to establish a confederate model in northern Syria.
Yeah, interestingly, it's not the Kurdish state, but the Turkish state that's not happy with this model because it's worried about its transborder implications. And so while the Rojava experiment has found a way to have at least a temporary accommodation with the Assad regime at the moment, it is under enormous pressure from military pressure. The territory has been bifurcated by the Turkish military. There's a Turkish occupation of a portion of Syrian territory in an attempt to prevent a contiguous political experiment from taking root on the ground for fear of its implications. So you're totally right. And this is what the Basque model is meant to indicate, that it's possible that neither France nor Spain has anything to be concerned about. But one reason for that is because they themselves are already embedded in a supranational arrangement that itself diminishes the sovereignty concerns grounded in irredentist communities trying to be separatist, because that's simply not something that's necessary in a supranational arrangement where rights can be nested and sovereignties can be nested. So that's the idea of the model. And as fully realized, Öcalan imagines the entirety of the Middle East, the whole of the Middle East and North Africa, being reorganized as a large democratic confederation, which is to say restoring the territorial contiguity in one large institutional arrangement rather than dividing the territory. So that's a utopian project, obviously. What's interesting here is less like, is this viable? It's not. Just to be clear, under the present configuration of states in the region, the likelihood that the Rojava experiment will survive long term is very low. But it's actually an argument for reimagining how the sort of like the political will around the construction of the states of the region could be reshaped if there was support at the popular level from the bottom up for a different, more plural conception of citizenship, one that was civic rather than ethnic, one that saw borders in the old way that they used to be. People, even, I mean, in living memory, can remember their grandparents traveling unimpeded, from Istanbul to Cairo, which would be impossible today, given visa regimes and border restrictions and conflict in the region. But there's a nostalgia for that idea. And the question is, how can it be translated into a political blueprint? And so that's really what he was trying to solve for. The happenstance contingency of the Syrian civil war that gave rise to an opportunity to show that there's at least one community in the region committed enough to this model of plural democratic arrangement that they would actually try to undertake it as a blueprint for how to govern themselves, even if only for a short period, is remarkable and unexpected. But the plan itself is a broader political theoretical intervention that disrupts and denaturalizes the idea that the states that we have now in the region are forever propositions.
Looks like we have a question over Zoom from Jill. Jill's asking, how can this, quote, idea be accomplished when Hamas governs Gaza and does not recognize the existence of Israel?
So a few things to say about that. First, to sort of address the core of the question, I think that one of the things that makes this vision really compelling is that it speaks to the legitimate aspirations of both peoples. And so if you look at what emerged as a Palestinian national consensus, a consensus that Hamas as well as Fatah embraced, it points to the creation of a Palestinian state with Jerusalem as its capital, an end to occupation, and the realization of Palestinian refugees' right of return. And so what is striking is that this approach allows for all of those aspirations to be realized. And so I think it provides an answer to those in Hamas who would demand that the consensus be observed, and to the extent that folks in Palestinian factions who oppose this framework, I think it also becomes possible to say, hey, we actually are seeing our aspirations responded to here. And so folks who oppose such a framework would be more naturally isolated. But having said that, I think it's important to add two things. The first is that I think the real challenge to moving forward with a framework like this at this juncture is not so much with the Palestinian national movement or with Hamas, but instead with the Israeli government, which at present has a vision committed to only one state in the region between the river and the sea, only one sovereignty, and that's Israel. And the current government has been very clear about that, but it's also at this juncture something that is more broad, a broader view among the Israeli public. So the movement that I mentioned is one that involves Jews and Palestinians working together, and the Israeli Jews who are involved are working very hard to change the views of their compatriots, but with a recognition of just how hard it is to do that. And the very last thing I'd say is, of course, that I'm not sure it's appropriate to think of Hamas governing Gaza at this moment in view of how decimated Gaza has become as a consequence of the military assault on it since the attacks of October 7th. And so that horror is one that will present its own challenges to resolve. But one hopes that it also will create at some point a sense of urgency to address these kinds of problems. And I know that poll numbers indicate that Palestinians are at present more supportive of a resolution of this kind than they were a year ago. And I think that that is a sign for hope. And I think that the analysis is that the reason they're more hopeful is because they believe, and I hope their belief is not frustrated, that the international community will finally do something to address the situation.
Thank you, Professor Dajani, and thank you, Professor Bâli, for your presentation, for the model for presentation of your model to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Is very, very complicated, and it's very, very interesting approach to me because, like, I don't recall back in the history that the two confronting states came to peace and then created the confederation, right? And my question leads: do you know such examples where I mean this worked out? And does your model require for the Palestinian to become the state which is recognized by the whole countries of the UN? Because currently it is like you can say it's like partially recognized, right? It's like not fully independent state. And if so, any steps that might allow Palestine to become the full independent states recognized by the UN members, by all UN member countries? Thank you.
Sure.
Omar, could I jump in with one example and then
please
give the answer on the second part?
I was hoping that you would.
Yeah, I mean, I think one obvious example to point to, it's not exactly of confederation, but it is of a model where you can see two warring countries that have a long history of being at war with each other find a way to engage in a nested sovereignties project that brings them into shared governance is France and Germany. After two wrenching world wars and genocidal violence, you have a model that seemed totally implausible in the early, let's say, right in 1944, 1945, that you would have a set of common institutions forged on first economic beneficial grounds and then political integration and eventually full integration across the continent of Europe, including and internalizing Germany. And yet that's exactly what's emerged. So that's a real-time sort of example of what it looks like to imagine joint institutions, permeable boundaries, as one way of solving the longstanding irredentist claims across these borders, such that Alsace-Lorraine is no longer a potential powder keg that holds the keys to a future world war, which was, for much of the first half of the 20th century, not to speak of the 19th and 18th centuries, absolute source of instability on the continent of Europe. Back to you.
Sure. I was actually going to cite the same example. And at the same time, I want to acknowledge it's a really difficult question that you're asking, and it's an important question. I don't think it is at all easy to build this kind of framework from a situation of conflict. And, in the France-Germany situation, of course, we had Germany's defeat in the Second World War and the Allied occupation of Germany, which made this kind of transformation possible. I think that in Israel-Palestine, that there really isn't an alternative to creating some kind of transitional framework inside Israel-Palestine. Now, Aslı and I have, some differing views about the extent to which that framework should be one in which the international community plays a controlling role or a supporting role. And Aslı, I think, brings skepticism founded in a lot of recent experience about international intervention, which I think is a fair point. But I will say that it's hard for me to imagine a framework like the one that I've just described being reached through negotiations of the kind that we saw 20 years ago. And I think there will need to be a robust international role to bring something like this into being. And I think, unfortunately, we're not yet close to that situation.
So we're starting to lose people, but also we're gonna have to close it since we've gone a few minutes over. If you could all again join me in thanking our magnificent speakers.
Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you so much.
It was a delight after all these years of hearing Omar speak of you, Aslı, to hear you in action. That was really thrilling.
Thank you. Thank you. Sorry if it was a too great length.
All right. And
Great work.
so ends our speaker series. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thank you, everyone. Thank you,
Thank you.
Aslı.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Omar.
Mike.
Thank you.
See
Love
you
to
soon,
all.
Omar. Take care.
Yes,
Good night.
for sure. Have a good one, everyone. Bye-bye.